Right. Hi, everyone. I know more people will be joining us, but I'd like to start on time to make sure to get through with our special guest today. I'm Riyad Bahour. I'm the coordinator for the Global Studies Program, and welcome to the last day of Reimagining the Future Earth and Global Justice Days at Sac City. We have a presentation today that I've really been looking forward to called Travar el Saber, a trans high school shifting normative educational narratives, with Dr. Salvador Vidal-Ortiz, who teaches at American University and who has co-authored Race and Sexuality and co-edited The Sexuality of Migration and Queer Brown Voices, all in English. And in Spanish, he co-edited Travar el Saber, loosely translated as Transing Knowledges, about education and trans people in Argentina, which you will hear more about in the presentation today. So Dr. Vidal-Ortiz will talk for about a half an hour, a little bit more maybe, and then we'll have the last 20 minutes or so for discussion. So Salvador, welcome, and we're really looking forward to your presentation today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming to the talk. I will try to deliver the talk in 30 minutes, and just so you know, I will minimize the windows so that I cannot be distracted by anything but the PowerPoint. If there are any questions, we should be able to have plenty of time to answer them. Most of the language questions I address in the PowerPoint. If there's something that you want to ask, I need for you to speak up because I can't see your images. So again, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and I want to talk to you about a project that is connected to a network of scholars in Latin America, the US, and portions of Europe called the Cuir Américas Working Group. Cuir, C-U-I-R, is connected to a different notion of queerness. It's a feminist and queer engagement that thinks through global and power relations and wants to reimagine the global north and the global south, and also reimagine the distribution of resources. So the project that I'm discussing with you, which has been published on a number of fronts in English and Spanish, is part of a broader network. And I'm happy to share more information about the working group later. But what I want to do is give you a sense of what the presentation will entail, because most people are unfamiliar with the idea of Travar el Saber, the book. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, which I'm also holding here, and then I'll talk about the article that Riyad and everyone at the Sacramento Community College shared with you. The first thing to do is to actually define some of the terms, because I think that if you see a term like travar and we connect it to travesti, we have to define it. Travesti in Spanish is not the same as travesti or transvestite in English. That term is a sexological term that has negative implications, that it's a term that doesn't suggest an identity, but an erotic expression. Travesti is one of the myriad of terms used in Latin America, like transgenerista and transformista, and travesti with an accent, that, as you see in the slide, that speak to a very specific subjectivity of particularly trans women in South America. And so trava is a diminutive of travesti. It's also derogatory, but we'll see that, like queer, a lot of trans and travesti activists have reclaimed it. There's a lot of issues in terms of structural inequality in Latin America that impact the life expectancy of trans women in particular. And the average is 30 to 35 years of age. Because there's such a structural system that excludes trans women from education, also from simply being part of families and engaged in healthy family formations. They get expelled from the house, they get bullied at school, and so they end up oftentimes working in sex work, which is the only form of survival employment that they can get. Travar el Saber is the notion of the book, which is in a way a repository. When Juliana Martinez and I, Juliana Martinez is a colleague from Colombia who also works at American University. When she and I went to Argentina and realized that there was no repository where we could see voices of trans students and faculty, we wanted to make sure that if we could, we supported that. And that is what this engagement is. So it is a specific book in Spanish, and I'll show you the link where you can download it if you want, because it's available for free online. And one thing that's important to note is that this book is authored by the 33 writers. So if you're looking at the screen, you'll see that I'm showing you the page where they appear alphabetically. Juliana Martinez and I are the editors of the book, but they're actually registered in the ISBN as authors. And it's one of the ways in which we think about shifting power relations in the way in which academia works with communities. So travar is an abbreviation of travesti, but it also means to truncate something. So you see at the bottom that the travar with B as in blue implies to jam something. Travar with the V as in voice implies to actually jam with a subject that is trans or travesti, right? And so we call that in the article that we shared with you, jamming as an intervention. And so it's both about transing the knowledge and the educational system, but it's also about placing the bodies on the line so that trans people can benefit from the opportunities, in this case, education. And this is Luana Berkins. You're gonna see this slide again later on. It's in Spanish on your left and in English on your right. This is from the first graduation. And Luana was talking about her vision. She was a significant activist who led a lot of trans movements. And she was also part of a lot of movements for cisgender women's rights and for abortion rights in Argentina, and also supported same-sex marriage. So she was a very intersectional activist, and I keep talking about her in the past because she died in about 4 years ago. There's two authors that to me serve as kind of bookends of the project. Alma Fernandez, who is from Tucumán and completed high school at the Bachillerato Popular Trans Mochacelis, which is the high school that I'm going to talk about with you. And a lot of her experience was connected to being a young kid who was bullied and literally forced out of both school and the family, and had to migrate to Buenos Aires to actually survive and to find other trans women like her in order to be able to find a sense of belonging and community. And you here see her quote about sort of that idea of the child that was once lost and that she was able to recover pieces of that child. She was able to recover when she came back to school at the Mochacelis. And then on the other end, if we were thinking of like these two placeholders or book holders, would be Vázquez de Haro, Claudia Vázquez de Haro, who is an activist and also has a PhD, and she completed her BA and PhD at the Universidad Nacional de La Plata, which is one of the top 3 universities in public universities in Argentina. And she uses a Freudian approach to how she engages in the classroom and also as an activist and scholar. To me, the two of them are implicitly the two women that in many ways created the idea around trans knowledges or jamming as an intervention. And we've been able to work with them and tour with them after the book came out. So the book is, as I noted before, is available online for free, and the webpage is noted there. I can also copy it and put it on the chat once I finish the PowerPoint. And it is important, again, because it is a repository of all of these stories that are not available, so that activists and other scholars can engage with them now as a record, as a public record that already exists. But I'm going to move, and these are some pictures from the launching of the book. I should note that the book focuses on the Bachillerato Popular Trans, which is the high school, and then both the Universidad de la Avellaneda, which is a kind of GED to college program, and then the Universidad Nacional de La Plata, which is the university that I was mentioning that grants PhD programs. While in the book, we have stories about all of these three sides. In the article, we focus specifically on the high school. Okay, and that's the Bachillerato Popular Trans Mochacelis. Here you see pictures of the first graduation, which happened in December of 2014. And at the top picture, you see Vida Morant, who was the academic director of the school at the time, a trans woman, and the director of the Department of Education is sitting next to her. Okay, so the article itself, as I noted before, is engaged with questions of knowledge production in a high school. And it is a GED format. I'm going to talk a little bit about that structure shortly. It is important because it is a school that has adjusted to the realities of trans and travesti people. It is in a neighborhood on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, and it operates in the afternoon and into the evening. Part of it is because a lot of the trans women who come, who are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, have had to continue to do sex work, and that work is done late at night and into the morning. So they need to sleep during the morning and into the afternoon. Loana Berkins, who I reference here, is really key in terms of thinking about the kind of setting that would allow for trans women to continue to live their lives in whatever ways they were able to survive, but also have access to educational spaces and institutions that would allow them to be able to engage in a way in which it wouldn't be artificial or force them to leave sex work if they didn't have to or want to, but that they would be able to engage with education after sleeping, after eating, right? Like come in their full selves. That's a very Freudian approach to thinking about education as well. There are three really important points, if you're not familiar with Argentina, that I think I want to make briefly. One is the idea of the popular, we would say in English, bachelor's, but bachelor in this context is high school, is not a bachelor's degree. And I'm going to talk about it. And then also a very important book, research book, The Feat of Asserting One's Own Name in English, and then the Gender Identity Law that is approved in 2012. The Bachillerato Popular becomes an option when people realize after an incredible crisis of dealing, a financial crisis in 2000, Nestor Kirchner and Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, who are from a relative left, have then spent a lot of time fostering the idea of communal or community educational settings. And the Bachilleratos Populares are one version of that. And it is about a horizontal democratic system of education instead of a hierarchical one. The programs themselves manage everything. Sometimes they get faculty who are paid by the state, by the Department of Education, but in general, they manage all of the expenses themselves, which at times creates crisis because they don't have a lot of resources to run the school, but at times they're able to operate with a minimum level of sort of organization, without chaos, and a set of opportunities to be able to offer the education that the students want. The second point that I wanted to mention is the feat of asserting one's own name, which was a really important book that Loana Berkins, who I mentioned at the beginning and will mention again, introduced. And it was like the kind of foundational piece that allowed for the documentation through about 100 and something surveys and some interviews to document the experiences of trans women and some trans men, although books after that, research after that focused more on both populations. And looking at the conditions, the structural conditions that trans women and travesti women were facing. And you can see some of those statistics here. There were other books that followed that project. Cumbia, Copeteo y Lágrimas is in the middle. And then The Butterflies Revolution is the one to your right. And that book actually was produced by the high school, the Travesti High School, Mochacelis, as part of one of their methodology classes. So they actually reenacted a research project that expanded. It moved beyond the city of Buenos Aires, and it included trans men, and it was gesturing toward the important contribution of La Gesta del Nombre Propio 10 years before. And then the third element or aspect that is structurally important to understand is that there was a gender identity law that passed in Argentina in 2012 that just changed how we understood the idea of trans rights in Argentina. This is very important because the gender identity law does not require that people have any psychiatric or psychological or surgical or hormonal access in order to affirm their gender identity. So it is a law that actually at that point becomes particularly radical in terms of allowing people for self-identification. And as I noted before, Chile and Uruguay added additional similar laws several years later. You see some of the stats here. That's Fernandez de Kirchner, the president at the moment, is with red hair on your left. And then on your right, there's an actress called Florencia Lavey, who's a trans actress who's been out for decades, very famous. She's carrying her new ID. Here you see Loana Berkins on the left, carrying her new ID. And again, Fernandez de Kirchner, the president. This is the definition that the law used to understand the idea of gender identity law. And then here we see Diana Zacayán, who's an activist who was actually murdered in 2016. And then Mauro Cabral, who's a trans activist, trans man's activist, who was also engaged both in the project of the gender identity law, but also engaged in the genesis of the Bachillerato Popular Trans Mochacelis. So the Bachillerato itself, the high school itself, offers this title of Community Development Specialist, and it's like a technical degree, would be the equivalent in the US. They have about 30 or 40 people in each cohort. What has changed since the first graduation in 2014 is that because the high school is in a neighborhood that's actually very marginal geographically in terms of being outside of the center of Buenos Aires, but also in terms of having a lot of poor communities, immigrant communities. So as a result, the school has now become a haven for trans and travesti women, trans men, but also like grandmothers who never finished high school and have taken care of their kids and grandkids, and now they're coming back to get their degree. Or cis male teenagers who were kicked out of school because they were too they had behavioral problems, or they just didn't adjust to the conditions of that school, they would be able to come to this school. So the school itself sort of appropriates the idea of being marginal and welcomes people who have been stigmatized or labeled that way into the school, but it still creates an educational setting where trans identity is at its core. These are the areas, and they have faculty that are both cis and trans. One of the tensions in the school is that the school principal has always been a cisgender gay man. Oftentimes the academic director, which is the second in command, if you will, has been a trans woman. And these are the objectives of the school. Basically, they want to create a space so that trans people are able to articulate themselves fully as subjects of rights, and then to think about social inclusion differently. I wanted to move to this slide because I think it actually connects well with some of those objectives. If you look at the last line, one of the things they talk about is embodying the idea of being trans and travesti, and they this is a very, very informative discourse to me, because it challenges the tenets of diversity, equity, and inclusion that we use in the US. So they say where diversity stops being a word and becomes a body, right? So like we think about diversity not in terms of counting people and counting different types of people, but no, this is my embodied experience, right? And this is how I come into the school. And it's influenced by Sarmiento, who was one of the founders of education in Argentina. He was also very racist and didn't necessarily think about education for women or indigenous people. So he was filled with contradictions 2 centuries ago when he was leading the educational system in Argentina. And they used his history in order to think about how Sarmiento, while he opened up some doors, really shut down some windows, and they wanted to be able to re-signify the contributions of Sarmiento. So what you see, the bullet on the left that you see, are a summary of the points that appear in this Facebook post that Vida Morante, the academic director that I mentioned before, and who appeared in one of those first pictures with the director of the Department of Education, often posted on Facebook. Facebook is one of those platforms, just like WhatsApp, that a lot of the students and the faculty use to communicate with each other. And so they wanted to construct a politics of education, but they didn't want to change the history of what Sarmiento had done. So what they end up doing instead is to transform the idea of what Sarmiento could have been. And for them, it wasn't because they wanted to honor Sarmiento, it was because they were thinking about how they could impact the legacy that Sarmiento left them, right? So it isn't about incorporating him, it is in some ways about challenging the ideas of what he himself produced, or what the high school could do to add to a legacy. And so I like to use the idea of Sarmiento, not because they think of Sarmiento as trans, but because they in some ways want to queer Sarmiento and to think of Sarmiento differently, with all of the contradictions that Sarmiento had. That in a way is something that Luana Berkins, who was foundational to the high school, said at the first graduation, which I showed you before. This idea of contaminating or transing knowledge for her was this idea of saying, which a saying that was spoken a lot among activists and students. When one trans person goes to school, the trans person changes. When a multitude of trans women go to school, the school itself needs to be transformed, right? So the idea of having numbers, and with those numbers, truncating and jamming the educational system, sort of the normativity of the educational system was inherently what Loana Berkins wanted to see. And she indeed had the opportunity to see this happen at the first graduation and before her death. Vida Morant, who I showed in the picture and also showed the Facebook post, also shows us how for her, it's really clear that the educational project of the Mochacelis is always rethinking education, right? So she says here, like, we come and we have these discussions, but then we come back to those discussions and we redefine them and we rethink them the next day, right? And then we rethink them, and they don't want to be right. The process itself is as important to the teachers and directors and students themselves as it is the idea of articulating formal education, right? So they, in a way, they're thinking about just shifting the notion that education has to produce very specific elements or that it has to be catered to tests, which is a lot of how we do education in the US, right? So in closing, and I'm doing good because we haven't even used the full 30 minutes, I want to highlight how the context of transignologies or jamming as intervention is a framework that comes from Loana Berkins that doesn't focus just on education. But one of the things that Loana, wise as she was, insisted on was to be able to say that if we created better conditions in educational sites, then work and health would follow. And she was effectively a visionary because in many ways, after getting all of these educational spaces to rethink themselves and to incorporate trans and travesti people and to incorporate topics about or that go beyond cis education and heteronormativity, they have been able to move that. They have ignited how Argentinians think of work. So right now, there is an effort to have an Alma Fernandez, one of the activists that I showed you early on, is now working for the government, working on that 1% trans-specific quota to have, and I put quota in quotation marks, we can talk about that some more, because the government has now passed laws where they want government agencies to give 1% of the employment to trans people. So they're recognizing the historical legacy of transphobia that the government, as part of the nation, has been absolutely explicitly involved in order to be able to create reparations of sorts. And now the government is very actively recruiting teachers, drivers, construction workers, anything you can imagine. Alma and other trans activists and government employees are looking for people to be hired by the state. So they're really changing the state itself and how it produces the idea of outsiderness through first education and then work. A lot of these jobs require that people have a high school equivalent, which is why the Mochacelis is very important. And then to matters of health, because oftentimes the idea, the transformation, the bodily transformation and transition of trans women in particular, but also of trans men, it's unsupervised. So, and it's oftentimes for trans women done on the streets. So moving to health and to think about all of these structural determinants of health and how they impact trans women has become important. And again, I think Loana was a seer in terms of thinking about that transition from education to work to health, to think citizenship different. That's it. This is a picture from the first graduation that says thank you to those who put their bodies on the line. I'm looking forward to having conversations and a discussion with you all.
Thank you so much, Salvador. That was really interesting. And I know I have a lot of questions and probably others do as well, and folks are thanking you in the chat. Well, while people are maybe thinking or collecting their thoughts, I wanted to ask you about something that came up in our conversations before, and as we were sort of preparing for your talk. And one of those things was this notion that we tend to think in the United States that somehow we're the vanguard, right? And we teach the world, or we export to the world, or maybe not just the US, but the West in general, right? Like Europe and the US. And what's so great about this example and many others that you're sort of working on in the Cuir Américas group is examples of what we can learn, right, from those in the global South. And even if we take ourselves out of the equation, conversations happening in the global South, in the South, right? People talking to each other and being models for each other without Europe and the North American context at all. Can you say a little bit more about that? Like what were some of the inspirations and that dynamic in general through your kind of hemispheric work in general?
Thank you for that question, Rieta. Absolutely. I mean, I maybe I rub it in on people in the US too often, but I often like to say that a gender identity law at a nation state level happened in a chaotic Argentina in the Southern Cone is really important for us to understand, right? Like it didn't happen in Europe, it didn't happen in the US, it happened in Argentina first. So it tells us something about how we imagine progress and modernity, right? And how those elements, there's a kind of fracture aspect to that idea that even in terms of education, oftentimes we think that we offer the best education in the US. And I get you to talk to people in Argentina from one of these public universities, and they're going to win. Like they're just so highly prepared in terms of their education. So to me, the idea that gender identity law as a law gets approved in Argentina is just one of the multiple ways in which we need to start rethinking our idea of who gets to set the bar, right? But also it is inherently partly why the Cuir Américas Working Group was founded, because we wanted to be able to demonstrate that there were activists, artists, and academics that were engaged in work that was transformative and that were moving along questions of equality and transformation more than equality. I think, to say it differently, in the US, trans rights are still engaged in questions of public bathrooms. And I don't think those questions are unimportant, right? But it tells you that those questions are sort of set pretty much like in the mindset of the US in individualistic terms, right? They're not systemic terms, right? If we think about that distinction, we're creating jobs and creating educational spaces that are safe for trans people to thrive, versus we want to make sure that trans people can go and use a restroom like anybody else, which is important and elementary, but it's not transformative in the systemic fashion that work and education are. Then we can see how these things are unfolding in front of us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And also the, as important as they are, the issues about bathrooms, they still in some ways center cisgender discomfort, right? Which is the cause of the bathroom crisis, right?
Yes.
To begin with.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that. Other questions, don't be shy. If you don't yet want to unmute your mic, you can write your question in the chat. Otherwise, we're an intimate group, so we invite you to unmute and speak.
Don't be shy, I'll throw in a joke.
But only after someone asks.
Oh, hi, yes.
Hi, you may have, I think you probably already went over this in the beginning of your talk, but I did not understand. So like in our community, just like we're taking back queer, You were talking about the travesti as well as trabajar. And I am wondering, would it have been travesti to begin with? Because it would have been more like to jam or to travel as opposed to, you know, something that would have been not looked upon as positive. Or is, I mean, is that the same situation where you're saying now it's okay to say travesti because it's like queer, or we're taking it back?
Yes, it's very similar to queer in that we're retaining it and we're
Okay.
taking away the power. But and it started. Trava is a very pejorative term. It started as a term to shame people who the society didn't recognize as women, right? So it is how it started, but it was reclaimed by activists, and it is also, thank you for asking that question, because in many ways, travesti is a contested, it's still a dominant category in Argentina, but it's contested in a way because trans, which is now a more globalized term, is in circulation, right? So you have younger people who are non-binary and who are transitioning from male to female or female to male, who see themselves as trans, right? And there's a class element. They think of travesti as a working class or sort of uneducated term. And it's also in many ways raised, because a lot of the people who claim a trans identity are younger, sort of closer to the hipster culture, and from less working class backgrounds. So travesti is still functioning as an important category in Buenos Aires, at least, which is where we collected all these stories. But it's still in tension with a newer category, which is trans. And a lot of old-time activists skip travesti precisely because of the class and race function that it brings up when you use it.
Got it. Well, I will tell you that I have an almost 17-year-old, and a lot of her friends identify as non-binary, trans, queer, and I think they're understanding earlier and earlier that it's okay, but they use trans all the time. I have a trans son as well. So I just think that it's becoming definitely, at least in my world, and the people that I know, it's becoming like we've taken it back, you know, and it's a positive word, not a negative word at all.
Yeah. I see 2 comments on the chat. I'm not sure. Yeah. Ria, do we want to address them?
Yeah, Luz and Isaiah. Luz, do you want to say your comment instead of me reading it? I'll just put you on the spot.
Sure. Hi, Salvador.
Hi, Luz.
Just when you talk about trans rights in this country, going straight to the question of bathrooms, or that we're stuck in that with bathrooms, I can't help but reflect that when we bring up the topic of the ERA in Washington, D.C., we're also told, oh, now bathrooms will be genderless and God knows what will happen then. So I think as much as we talk about the power hierarchies that are the context for trans rights, for all human rights, for the rights of young people, because I think that's really big here, right? As you're talking about young people who are systematically denied rights pretty much everywhere. And that we have to acknowledge that we have not addressed gender at all in all of its complexity. And so sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, you know, Suzanne Farr once said the weapon of sexism, and I believe that remains true.
Luz Guerra is an important activist for Latino queer and queer communities of color in the US. So you are in presence of a quasi goddess. I'm just gonna say that. And she's also in Queer Brand Voices, which is one of the books that I had the pleasure of editing. I think one of the ways in which there's also a difference in Argentina with what you're saying, Luz, is that Loana Berkins and other trans activists marched in 2000 for women's rights. And in the history that cis women wrote, they're not existent. If you ask them, they'll tell you about them. Oh yeah, of course I saw Loana Berkins there, right? Not that they needed to be documented, but I think my point here is that in Argentina, trans women have thought about this idea that we call intersectionality in the US way before, right? Like they've been articulating an activism that's about, wait, you think you own women's bodies? No, you don't own my body, you don't own their body, right? And so they've thought about sexism, homophobia, and heterosexism together in ways that have been very productive. I don't see that as the case in the US. And I think, I mean, a very sad joke is to always think about how many gay men appear at clinics for sexual and reproductive rights in the US, right? To escort women that are coming in. Close to zero, right? Like they don't see that as an issue that impacts them. That's not the political context in Argentina. But not that your point is not well taken, but it made me think of how it also varies in that context in Argentina, because they're not thinking just about their rights, right? They're thinking collectively. And I think it is in some ways that socialist perspective that Argentinians have historically had, not that there hasn't been a right in Argentina as of lately either, but that has impacted a lot of how they engage.
I am not remembering this feminist intellectual's name, Argentinian, going back to the 1970s, probably early, who did an analysis of, you know, we have this military government, we have this military hierarchy, we have this military repression, and let's look at that in the microcosm of how that is reproduced in the family. Let's look at how patriarchy exists on a microcosm and on a macrocosm. And so I've not tracked Argentina, you know, haven't been there recently as you have, but I would, it makes me think that, yes, those conversations were happening in a more urgent way because women, and I would assume other gendered people as well, whether or not they were openly accepted by feminists, were already taking apart social constructs because it was a life or death issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so, you know, hopefully, I also think, let's be real, Argentina has a far better education system, much higher level of education than the United States, and far more gender equity. So the cradle of where something comes out of is also.
And as you said, also a place of contradictions, heavy contradictions. I think when Trump was president is when the average person in the US started seeing this country as a place that could be like, that you could begin to feel as a place filled with contradiction. But you have Latin America like going through that for decades, right? Like it's their bread and butter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Luz. And before that, thank you, Anne, also for your comments and question. Isaiah, do you want to elaborate a little bit? Am I saying your name right? On your comment?
Yeah. It's Isaiah.
Isaiah.
Yeah. See, I didn't know anything about the Argentina education system. I didn't realize it was better like than the United States. So I learned that, but I also knew that the United States didn't have the best education system. I just think I don't want to preface, I don't really know anything about like transgender rights or the community or anything, but I just know with any issue that we have to admit that we have that issue, because a lot of the times in this country, we see that we have the best system in something, like the best school system or something else, and it makes us not want to like actually consider any other changes or consider doing it like other people do it. We just want like other countries to do it how we do it. But yeah, definitely the first step is to recognize what's wrong, and then take a look at then you can take a look at what other people are doing.
Thank you.
Good point. And you got a yes reaction from Jessica.
Grupo.
I didn't even know we could do yes reactions. That's
I
great.
didn't know either. That.
I have a question about curriculum.
Sure.
Can you give us like an example of transing the curriculum or queering the curriculum? Like what?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes. They have, as I noted, they have 10 courses and 4 areas: natural sciences, language and communication, social sciences, and technical and professional skills. They would actually have a history class, and they would look at the legacy of Sarmiento, right? Which was the Department of Education director in the late 1800s. And they would, in some ways, interpolate, or they would interrogate a lot of the elements of how he envisioned that education, right? They would place themselves as trans subjects in that moment, in that historical moment, right? What would it mean if we had been recognized? And it wasn't, they don't often do it in a way that it is about, you know, that sort of neoliberal educational moment of the 21st century in the US, me, you're not catering to me, you're not explaining it to me, you need to dumb it out to me, right? Like, it's not that, but it's thinking, how would that society be different? And what can we learn from that moment to think at to think about an aspect of society today that can be more welcoming? And it starts with trans and travesti experience, but it really moves to like all of those multiple marginalizations that I was talking about, right? Like what happens to the Venezuelan migrant that gets discriminated against in the context of Argentina now, right? What happens to the grandmother that's now coming to the school, right? Like sort of, and then there's affinities that get developed. So we didn't exist as Travas, and you couldn't vote, right? Like there's these connections are made among the students to interrogate the whatever historical curriculum they're looking at. It's harder, well, partly because I was not in some of those classes, but it's harder to envision how that happens in math just because of the subject matter. But I think it happened a lot in history. It happened a lot in languages, like the conversation that I was just sharing with you about the tension between travesti and trans is a tension that you see in curriculum in like English courses. And so there's a couple of other, there's a course that a lot of students have to take that's a community requisite. And oftentimes they look at what is the local governance doing, right? It's kind of like a requisite to operate connecting to social work and social services, sort of how to strategize politically with the resources and the systems that social services offer. So they end up working either in communications, like how do we draft a press release? How do we write an advocacy brief so that we have folks from that government office respond, right? Like how do we give visibility? So there's a connection, there's a kind of inherent activist connection to the kind of interventions that they create in some of those classes.
It's interesting. It's kind of like reopening windows. Like you used the metaphor that Sarmiento closed open some doors but close some windows.
Mhm.
This kind of approach is reopening or opening windows that were never open even. Jessica wrote a comment about a biology professor at Sac State who uses the determination of gender versus the determination of physiological sex as the core of his biology class. It's really fascinating. Yeah, it's kind of like where there's a will, there's a way. I think a math instructor who, with the right windows open, could come up with some good curriculum.
When they were developing in that methodology, that research class, when they were developing the survey for La Revolución de las Mariposas, that last book that I showed in that trilogy, they brought different classes like 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. They brought them together because they were all surveys going into the field, collecting data. And so the class wasn't in one of the classrooms, it was in the main hall. And you could see that the faculty who had masters and were getting their PhDs, you could see them engaging in conversations about knowledge production and sort of power, like why this is important without selling your soul, right? Like sort of thinking about epistemology and how this produces knowledge that can then redistribute in some ways resources, but that's not the only way in which you create knowledge, and that you want to be cautious about that. Like they were having these parallel discussions while they were creating a survey to document the systemic violence that trans people had experienced, right? So you can unpack the tenets of the disciplinary practice that you're using, or the field, right, or the topic that you're covering in the class. You unpack them at the same time as you say, well, we got to do them because we need to actually honor Loana, do this work, and document the state of these populations today.
I don't want to move from the topic that you presented on, but and so if people have more questions about it, please jump in. But I did want to ask you, just from your work with Cuir Américas in general, do you have other examples? Obviously, you can't go into as much detail, but are there other examples of things that you think that you'd like to explore more happening in the rest of the hemisphere outside of Argentina, or that should be on our radar, right? Interesting things going on.
Also in Argentina, there's been a lot of work to look at social media and rethinking communications so that trans and travesti people can be the people telling stories directly. Some of the folks, particularly trans women that I'm thinking of, have come out of the Bachillerato Popular Trans Mochacelis. So they're now thinking about moving beyond a paper product to something that's more social media based and web based. Thinking about forms of documenting that can be available on a cell phone, as opposed to the typical traditional paper book. That is also happening in Argentina now, and we're beginning to talk about it. Some of what the Cuir Américas Working Group has wanted to do from the beginning is access resources so that the scholarship produced in the Global South is actually translated in English and in other languages so that it can be distributed, and so that we can shift a little bit the imbalance of power in how knowledge is distributed. And we're always seeking donors and scholars who have, or philanthropists who have access to resources for those projects, because those projects require a lot of time and skilled people to translate. And so we've been pressed to think about that. We did a special issue of GLQ last year. It ended up being 3 special issues, with a journal in Brazil, in a journal in Argentina. So, and they were published in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So we circulated work that often circulates in the Southern Cone, we wanted it to appear in GLQ and vice versa, right? So it's a tripartite special issue that started with the idea of publishing in GLQ in 2 or 3 languages, but then it became, let's actually have articles be reviewed and recognized as peer reviewed, and then like locate them in these 3 sites. And that just came out. So we're thinking now, strategizing now about more translation, because we haven't really had access to a lot of that.
Cool, thank you. And Luz, you have your hand up.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, Salvador, because it's like I hear in your descriptions, it evokes for me popular education, Freirean pedagogy, liberation theology, liberation psychology, which has, perhaps has been in the minority oftentimes in Latin America, but was still where people got schooled and where people got educated, that it feels like this organic, that it's in there, it's in the thread, it's in the weaving. And it reminded me of in Oakland, 13th Street, downtown, my car had a boot on it. And I was waiting for the city to come and unlock me, which, by the way, was an unjust boot. And I'm having like these strange encounters with people on the street who are making comments about being booted. And this young Black trans woman, and I will say that she was clearly, I would say lower income, and identified herself as such, came up to me. She was beautiful. I mean, we just had the greatest meeting there as she was opining on what was happening. And she said, I grew up in Oakland. I went to the Black Panther Party breakfast program. I was in the Black Panther Party school, elementary school. So you can't tell me about oppression, and I was like, that's right. And so because you had this liberation and this liberatory atmosphere that reached 1-2 generations of children, and then how many people came out of that and incorporated into what they were doing in the same way and in a much bigger way, because Latin America has had more influence by Freirean pedagogy and by liberation psychology, Ignacio Martin Baró, etc. It to me, it sort of reveals how very closed the United States is and how much there is to learn. If we can reverse that, to go back to your first speaker today, Riyad, or second, Linda Kikivis, talking about, those above and those below the borderline of power, right? Which, how many conversations have we had about that? That the students in the US are missing something by not being able to have been in a society where those influences have been more popular and had more legitimacy. They've not been red baited.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Racialized.
Just to go back to Riyad's recent question, I mean, one of the goals for the Cuir Américas Working Group is to actually have the North be removed from South-South conversations, right? Like, there's a point in which you say, we can't mediate this anymore. So let's make sure we step back, or we facilitate South-South work, and it gets done. And and if we get the funding, we get it translated, but it's not about us, right? It's about the work that they can do. And I think some of that is like what we're experiencing. To your point about the trans woman you saw, that you had a conversation with, there's a book, One Dimensional Queer, by Rod Ferguson, that actually looks at Sylvia Rivera, and in a way also Marsha P. Johnson,
yeah,
as these three-dimensional activists that were influenced by the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, and even if they were excluded from those spaces, right? But they had an intersectional lens. And he looks at how gayness, like the movement, becomes one-dimensional because it becomes race and class in ways that exclude any other category of social analysis but sexuality, right?
And US. And
Yeah,
US.
and US, absolutely. Nations say yes, absolutely.
It comes from the US.
Yes.
Yeah, stop the US funding. You kick the State Department out of your conversations.
Clearly, we're just getting into the really rich stuff, right? Thank you so much, Salvador, and for a great presentation and getting
Thank
us
you, everyone.
sort of going in this direction. And hopefully we'll have you back at some point, and Luz, you too, and everybody else. Isaiah, Alicia, Anne, and Gulzar for being here and participating.
Take good care. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, anytime. We'll do it again. Take care, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.